Tonight's story is not really about one threat, one statement, or one headline. It is about a narrow waterway that sits between Iran and Oman and quietly carries a huge share of the world's energy. Most days, people never think about it. But when traffic there slows, markets notice immediately, governments notice immediately, and households around the world can end up feeling it through fuel bills, shipping costs, airline prices, and inflation. That waterway is the Strait of Hormuz. It is one of the most important oil transit choke points in the world. Most viewers know the name, but far fewer know just how much moves through it or why even a partial disruption can have global consequences. This is not a side route. It is one of the core arteries of the modern energy system. Here is the basic picture. Large volumes of crude oil, refined products, and liquefied natural gas move through this narrow passage from producers in the Gulf to buyers around the world, especially in Asia. When traffic is steady, the system looks routine. When traffic slows, everything from oil traders to shipping insurers to finance ministries starts paying attention. And this is where careful reporting matters. There's a big difference between a formal legal closure and an effective commercial shutdown. Those are not the same thing. A route can remain technically open under international navigation rules while becoming too dangerous, too expensive, or too unpredictable for most normal shipping activity. That distinction is critical to understanding the current moment. According to maritime security advisories, there has not been a formal legal closure declared in the narrow legal sense. But maritime authorities have also raised the regional risk level to the highest tier, meaning attack risk is considered extreme. Commercial vessels have been attacked, threats have been broadcast, insurance conditions have changed. Ship owners and charterers have become far more cautious. Crews are weighing safety. In the real world, that combination can slow traffic dramatically, even if no official paper says the route is shut. And markets care about real-world behavior, not legal semantics. If ship owners hesitate, if insurers withdraw war risk cover, if captains delay transit, if ports start dealing with vessel clustering, and if buyers begin scrambling for alternatives, that is enough to move prices. The global energy system does not wait for a courtroom definition. It reacts to risk, timing, cost, and uncertainty. That is exactly why this story matters now. Recent reporting tied to shipping data said about 3,200 ships were idle in the Gulf, with roughly 500 more waiting outside near the coasts of the UAE and Oman. That does not mean 3,200 giant oil tankers were lined up in one cinematic queue. It means a very large number of commercial vessels of different types were being caught up in a broader regional disruption. It is a sign of paralysis in movement, not just a dramatic number for a thumbnail. That nuance matters because exaggerated language can make a story sound bigger in the moment and less credible over time. The truth is already serious enough without distortion. Now let's step back and ask the obvious question. Why should someone far from the Gulf care about this? Because the Strait of Hormuz is not just important, it is deeply embedded in the world economy. A very large share of global seaborne oil trade passes through it. Huge volumes of crude oil and petroleum products move from major Gulf producers through this narrow corridor. On top of that, almost 1/5 of global LNG trade also moves through the same passage. That means this is not only an oil story, it is also a natural gas story, an electricity story, an industrial cost story, and potentially an inflation story. And that last part is where many headlines lose viewers. People hear oil disruption and think only about gasoline prices. But energy sits inside almost everything. It affects shipping rates, airline fuel, trucking, fertilizer, chemicals, plastics, manufacturing costs, and food distribution. So when a choke point like Hormuz becomes unstable, the effects can travel far beyond the pump. That does not mean every worst-case scenario is guaranteed. It means the system is highly exposed, and exposure is the real theme of the story. The Strait of Hormuz handles volumes that cannot easily be replaced overnight. Yes, there are alternative export routes. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have pipeline systems that can bypass some Hormuz traffic, but the spare capacity on those routes is still far below the volume that normally moves through the strait. In other words, bypass options help, but they do not erase the problem. That is why markets react so fast. In commodity markets, traders do not wait for every missing barrel to disappear physically before prices move. They price probability. If the market begins to believe that a major route is too risky for normal traffic, premiums start climbing immediately. Shipping becomes more expensive, insurance becomes more expensive or unavailable. Buyers search for substitute cargoes. Producers start calculating storage constraints. Importers start thinking about emergency reserves and alternate supply lines. And that is before a full physical shortage shows up. This is also why the first phase of a crisis can look financial before it looks physical. Futures move, freight rates move, insurance premiums jump, market commentary gets louder. Only later, if disruption persists, does the strain begin working its way deeper into supply chains and national economies. So the duration of the disruption matters every bit as much as the headline that starts it. A brief shock can still be expensive, but the system may absorb it. A sustained disruption is a different category of problem. Because once export traffic stays constrained long enough, the issue is no longer just whether ships can move. It becomes whether producers can keep producing at the same pace. If cargoes cannot leave in sufficient numbers, inventories can back up. If storage fills, output may have to slow. That is when a shipping crisis starts turning into a supply crisis. And when a market as central as oil starts worrying about both shipping risk and supply risk at the same time, volatility becomes much harder to contain. Now add LNG to the picture. This is where the story becomes even more globally relevant. Qatar remains one of the world's major LNG exporters, and shipments from Qatar and the UAE rely heavily on Hormuz transit. That means the effect of disruption is not limited to crude buyers. It matters to gas importers, utilities, power markets, and industrial users that depend on LNG. So if someone says this is just a regional maritime story, that is too narrow. It is a global energy eroding story. And because so much of that energy is bound for Asia, the regional exposure is not evenly distributed. Major Asian importers watch Hormuz especially closely because large volumes of crude and LNG headed to China, India, Japan, and South Korea rely on this corridor. Europe may be less directly exposed to Hormuz crude than some Asian markets are, but it can still feel the pricing effects through global energy markets, and LNG tightness can spread pressure more broadly depending on weather, stock levels, and available alternatives. The United States is not immune either. Even if the physical barrels do not all go to American buyers, oil prices are global. A serious supply scare abroad can still influence fuel costs, shipping costs, inflation expectations, and financial markets at home. That is why this story travels so quickly from maritime advisories to trading desks to political speeches. But here is where a policy-safe, fact-based script has to stay disciplined. There are things we know, and there are things we should frame as risk rather than certainty. What we know is that maritime authorities raised the risk level to critical. We know commercial vessel incidents were reported. We know shipping database reporting described thousands of ships idle or waiting in relation to the disruption. We know the Strait of Hormuz carries a massive share of global oil and LNG flows. We know bypass options are limited compared with normal throughput. And we know energy prices have moved sharply as a result of the conflict and disruption risk. What we should not do is pretend that the most extreme outcome is already locked in. A responsible script does not say the global economy has definitely collapsed. It does not say every ship crossing will certainly be destroyed. It does not say households everywhere will immediately face a guaranteed price explosion by a specific date. That kind of certainty may get clicks, but it weakens credibility and raises platform risk. The stronger approach is simpler. Explain the mechanism clearly and let the facts carry the weight. So let's look at the mechanism. First, the route becomes unsafe enough that operators reduce normal traffic. Second, vessel clustering increases near ports and anchorages as ships delay transit. Third, insurance and crewing complications reinforce the slowdown. Fourth, energy markets reprice risk. Fifth, if disruption lasts, producers, refiners, importers, and governments begin adjusting real physical decisions. That is how a narrow strait turns into a global economic story. And there's another important layer here: confidence. Shipping is not just about steel hulls moving through water. It is a confidence system. Owners need confidence, charterers need confidence, insurers need confidence, crews need confidence, ports need confidence, financiers need confidence. If enough of that confidence breaks at once, a route can become commercially dysfunctional, even before it is physically impassable. That is exactly why the distinction between legally open and functionally unusable matters so much. For many ship owners, the question is not whether transit is technically legal. It is whether transit is commercially and operationally rational. If the answer becomes no, traffic slows sharply. And once traffic slows sharply in a choke point like this, the effects multiply. Refineries may need to reshuffle feedstock plans. LNG buyers may start seeking other cargoes. Freight markets tighten. Delivery schedules slip. Port congestion creates secondary delays. Buyers pay more to secure supply. Sellers reassess how much they can move. Governments start talking about emergency options. This is why a story that begins with maps and ship counts can end with inflation pressure, budget stress, and political consequences far from the Gulf. For central banks and finance ministries, geopolitical energy shocks are especially difficult. You can respond to demand-driven inflation with conventional tools more easily than you can respond to a maritime choke point crisis. If higher energy costs start feeding into transport, industry, and consumer prices, policymakers are forced to react to inflation they did not create and cannot directly fix. So this is not only a shipping story, it is also a policy story, and it is a political story. When a key energy corridor becomes unstable, major importing countries suddenly have a direct economic reason to push for de-escalation, protected transit, or emergency market stabilization. They do not need to be military participants in the conflict to feel the pressure. Their exposure arrives through energy prices, freight rates, and supply security. That is one reason the Strait of Hormuz has always mattered beyond the Gulf itself. It is both a transport route and a geopolitical lever. Still, the safest and strongest version of this story avoids loaded language that overreaches. For example, if a public statement warns that ships attempting to cross could be attacked or set on fire, that is obviously newsworthy. But the right way to use that information is as evidence of a severe threat environment affecting commercial decisions, not as proof that every attempted transit will automatically end in destruction. Again, precision makes the analysis stronger, and the story is still intense even when told precisely. Think about what has to happen for a modern energy corridor to start malfunctioning at scale. You need enough danger that vessel owners hesitate. You need enough uncertainty that insurers change terms. You need enough congestion that schedules break down. You need enough market fear that prices rise ahead of confirmed shortages. And you need enough persistence that a temporary risk event starts turning into a broader economic event. That threshold is lower than many viewers assume. The Strait of Hormuz does not need to be permanently and formally sealed for the world to feel pain. It only needs to become dangerous enough, expensive enough, and unpredictable enough for normal commercial behavior to break down for long enough. That is the real takeaway. Not cinematic inevitability, not doomsday certainty, just a very serious exposure in a very important corridor. So what should viewers watch next? Watch the security environment first. Are there additional confirmed attacks on merchant shipping? Does the risk guidance improve or deteriorate? Do military escorts become credible and widespread? Or do operators still refuse normal transit? Does navigational interference ease or persist? Then watch commercial behavior. Are insurers restoring cover or pulling back further? Are more ship owners resuming voyages, or are waiting vessel counts still elevated? Does vessel clustering increase around UAE and Oman anchorages? Are freight rates and war risk costs stabilizing or worsening? Then watch the energy market response. Are oil and LNG prices settling down because the market sees a temporary shock, or staying elevated because the disruption looks longer lasting? Are governments discussing reserve releases, rerouting plans, or emergency supply arrangements? Are major importers signaling concern? Those are the indicators that matter most. Because once you understand those, you can read past the dramatic headlines and focus on what the system is actually doing. And what the system appears to be doing right now is this. It is slowing down under pressure. Not because every legal condition has changed, but because the practical conditions for normal commerce have deteriorated sharply. That is why the 3,200 ship figure matters. Not as a viral talking point, but as a sign that movement in and around the Gulf has been disrupted on a broad enough scale to affect confidence across shipping and energy markets. That is why the critical maritime risk warning matters. Not because it sounds dramatic, but because it changes how commercial actors behave. That is why the limited bypass capacity matters. Not because alternatives do not exist, but because they do not fully replace normal Hormuz volumes. And that is why the price moves matter. Not because every forecast will come true, but because markets are already assigning a cost to the disruption risk. For ordinary viewers, the simplest summary is this. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's most important energy corridors. Recent threats, attacks, and risk warnings have made normal commercial transit much harder. That disruption has already affected shipping behavior and energy pricing. And if it lasts, the impact can spread from tanker routes and commodity markets into the wider economy. That is the sober version of the story, and honestly, it is the most powerful one. Because you do not need exaggeration when the facts already show how exposed the global system is to a narrow stretch of water, a breakdown in confidence, and a few days of severe disruption in one of the world's most critical maritime choke points. In calm periods, systems like this look efficient. In crisis periods, they reveal how little slack they really have. And that is why the Strait of Hormuz matters tonight. Not because every extreme scenario is guaranteed, but because the world depends on this route enough that even a partial breakdown in normal traffic is already costly, already consequential, and already big enough to command the attention of markets, governments, and consumers around the world.